But I want to ask, I want to start with a question that's actually not in my notes. Do you remember what we talked about last Sunday? Oh, I guess I have to repeat that one then. So last Sunday we talked about hope. And our theme here is about regifting. I just want to throw something out here. When I was about 57 years old, I went back to school, worked on a master's. And I had a choice, because really I wasn't looking for any kind of academic credit. I just wanted to be in a different environment that challenged my thinking. And so I chose to go to SFU and work on a master's in Master of Arts in General Liberal Studies. Very fascinating way to do. Read 2 books a week, engaged in a lot of discussion, and it was a time of tremendous growth. Here's what I discovered. Because I had the option of auditing the course. But do you know what auditing a course is? You show up. You don't have to do the assignments, and you just show up. You know what happens when you audit a course? You learn absolutely nothing. Because the learning takes place when you start putting into practice and you actually have to do the assignments. Let me challenge you not to audit your faith and just show up on a Sunday morning. And it's not that we, quote, take this for credit, but the idea here is that your pastors come before you, have spent hours before God to speak to you of what God is speaking into our lives. And the purpose here is transform lives. And if we're not experiencing any kind of transformation as we come together like this, we're probably all kind of wasting our time. So my challenge to you is, don't audit. I'm going to give you homework every Sunday when I preach. The challenge is go out and do it. And if you want to stay later, we have a sermon discussion around adult Sunday school, at least for the month of December. So I've said my bit. Let me jump into where we're going to go today. Let me ask you another question. Have you ever been part of something significant, but you were given very little, if any, recognition for the part you played? It may have been, a production, a dramatic production someplace where there's so many people that work behind the scenes. There's a few actors that are on stage and they do everything. They're in the limelight. But there's a whole crew of people that are behind the stage, behind the scenes, that are making it happen. Maybe at work you're working on a project and it's a team basis that works on projects. You know how teams are that work on projects, whether it be an assignment at school or at work. There's always one or two in a team of 3 or 4 or 5 people who do basically nothing. And there's always 1 or 2 that do all the work, but don't get the full credit for that. Perhaps it's involvement in ministry here at the church where you're part of putting on an event and planning the event. I'm conscious of the fact that as leaders here, as pastors, we stand before you. But there's a whole crew of people that work behind the scenes here. I've been blessed in all the churches I've been at, including especially this one as well, of having a tremendous office staff here that makes us look like we know what we're doing. I'm often asked, I'm told or asked, okay, I've already planned this, what do you want me to do with this? And I'm thinking, I didn't even think about that, actually. So there's these people who work behind the scenes to make things happen, and bless them, because many of them are, that's their goal in life. They thrive off helping others succeed. But when we come to the Christmas story, when we come to the whole account of the birth of Jesus, there's somebody who's often overlooked and underappreciated, I believe. One of the characters in this story is very much that way. But he's one who plays a very significant role, and especially behind the scenes. And I'm talking about Joseph. He always seems to be in the background, doesn't he? He doesn't get any speaking parts in Scripture. At least he's not quoted as saying anything. I'm sure he had many conversations with Mary. probably many with his family as well, about what was taking place. He's not mentioned really in any of our Christmas carols. Have you realized that? I grabbed a hold of an old MB hymnal. Do you remember what hymnals are? Do you even know what they are? And I leafed through all the Christmas songs that were in that hymnal. And I came across exactly one song, Angel We Have Heard on High, that Joseph gets passing mention in the 4th verse. He's relegated to the 4th verse. You know, we sing songs about the shepherds and about the angels, and we sing our lungs out for that. And of course, Mary and baby Jesus show up. And then there's some songs that have the wise men, kind of usually all compressed in a way that kind of defies actually the way Scripture tells us. But we sing all these songs, but we never sing anything. Joseph never shows up in any one of our songs, and he seems to be the afterthought of so many things. Yet Joseph is a key player here. He has a front row seat, if you like, at the birth of Jesus. In fact, his role was probably a very active one, because given the way the birth of Jesus came about, he probably was the one who delivered the baby. He's the one that ran and got the hot water, did all the things that needed to be done in order for that baby to be delivered. And so I think he's a pretty important person. Well, today we have lit the second candle in the Advent wreath, as David said, which is known as the Bethlehem candle, and it represents faith. It symbolizes faith. You know, the prophet Micah, in his prophetic statement pointing ahead to the coming of the Messiah, he says, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will rule over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times." I'm struck as I kind of read through and reread the story of the birth of Jesus and look at some even the prophetic things, such as this one given by the prophet Micah, about how big a part of that story are some relatively insignificant people that wouldn't get tremendous recognition anywhere, taking place in a very insignificant way in an insignificant place. But what comes across is the faith that those people had in trusting God and taking him at his word and acting on what he had told them to do. Joseph in particular is for us, I believe, an example of what it means and what it looks like to live a life of faith, a life that is marked by faith. He lived out his faith, and in the process, he's regifted others, including ourselves, in our time. So when we talk about faith, what are we talking about? Hebrews 11:1 says that faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Now, some of us have been around the church a long time, and we've heard these things read, and we kind of pass over them. Have you ever stopped to think, that just doesn't make sense when you read something out of the Bible? You think, come on, that just does not make sense. I don't know about you, but I think I have more confidence and assurance in what I can see than what I can't see. But faith, the Bible tells us, is confidence and assurance in what we cannot see. And in fact, the writer of Hebrews goes on to say that without faith, without that kind of faith that is confident in what we cannot see, it is impossible to please God. That is really counterintuitive, isn't it? And I think it's because when we exercise the faith that God calls us to exercise, it means that he has to show up, that he has to be a part of what we're doing and lead us in the process of that. Faith, when we come across it in the Bible, implies action. It's not just a simple passive statement of what we believe, but involves living that out in our everyday lives. So a life of faith calls on us to trust in God rather than ourselves and what we see and what we have. And that makes all the difference in living for something other than ourselves when we do that. And so the author of Hebrews says, this is what the people that he lists in that chapter 11, which are all the heroes of faith, he says, this is what these people were commended for living out by faith. Now, while Joseph is not among those that he lists, and there are many that the writer of Hebrews himself says he doesn't have time to go into, I believe Joseph was truly someone who lived out his faith in his life. So I want to take a closer look today at him as we focus on what it means not only to live our faith, but in the process to regift others with it as well. Truth is, we really know very little about Joseph, at least as far as anything that is said specifically about him. Matthew begins his gospel account by tracing his family lineage back to Abraham and David, which would have made him a possible heir to the throne of David. But the reality is, in Joseph's times, in many ways, that would have been to put him actually in great danger. You see, there was a king over Israel, albeit one who did not have a legitimate claim to the throne. Now, Joseph and his father before him lived in a time when Israel was occupied and ruled by Rome. In 63 BCE, Pompey had captured Jerusalem and marked the beginning of Roman rule. Then a number of years later, in 37 BC, they were tired of a series of insurrections that were taking place in Palestine, and they placed a king of their own choosing, King Herod, who himself was not regarded as a Jew by the Jews as either one of them or a legitimate person to rule over it. The Rome put him in charge and reigned over Israel. His reign was marked by ambitious projects, including rebuilding the temple. He sought at times to win over the favor of the Jews, but his primary concern was actually not for them, but it was for his own lust for power. I think we see a lot of leaders today who hold power and abuse of that power that they hold. They're really not all that concerned about the people that they are supposed to be leading, and are very ruthless about how they go about it. And Herod was one. He was ruthless in eliminating any threats to his ability to stay in power, including he put to death 3 of his own sons and probably 2 of his own wives. He was given to mood swings and temperamental outbursts of rage, at which time no one was safe in his vicinity. He ruled through fear and intimidation. He was well aware of the expectations of a Messiah coming to rescue the people of Israel from foreign rule, and even tried at times to promote himself as promote the idea that he himself possibly could be that. While living under the tyranny of Rome and the tyranny as well of the rule of Herod, no doubt fostered among the Jews in that time a growing longing and expectation for the Messiah to come on the scene and rescue them. Well, it says this is the context in which Joseph finds himself living when we first come across him in the verses that were read in Matthew's account. It was a political situation of unrest and turmoil and uneasy peace at times that no doubt affected him in some way or another. We all are affected by the situations in which we are born and raised. And those things have long-term effects on us. And I believe in Joseph that's a little bit who he was as well. But we don't have time to get into that. Let's turn to the text that was read earlier, and let's see what we can learn about Joseph that perhaps we hadn't noticed or thought about before. As I say, we pass over Joseph most of the time. Well, verse 18 in most of our English translations launches into what seems like a new section in Matthew's gospel. Matthew started out, of course, by giving this account of the life and ministry by Jesus, by going through this long genealogy of Jesus that covers three sets of 14 generations, going all the way back to Abraham. But there's a little word that in most of our translations is left untranslated, and I think is done for the smoothness of moving into it. It's that little word that connects what Matthew is beginning to say here in verse 18 with what he has just said, in contrast to what he has just said. So you could read verse 18 starting out this way, but this is how the birth of Jesus Christ came about. In other words, Matthew's trying to say there's something different that took place with the birth of Jesus that was not part of all these these people that he's listed out in the genealogy, where he says this was who was the father of, and the father of, and the father of. And so when you compare the birth of Jesus to the possible birth of all these people, there's something different. And then he moves on and he says, and we said there's an immediate problem here. Because his mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph. It says, but before they came together, she was found to be with child through the Holy Spirit. Now, we can be so familiar with the story that we read that and we kind of pass over it. I want to kind of park ourselves here, because what I want to invite you to be is to enter into Joseph's experience in terms of who he is, what he has to wrestle with in his time. The cultural customs surrounding marriage in those days was followed 2 or 3 different stages. To begin with, most marriages were arranged by their parents. How would you like to have your parents arrange your marriage? Truth is, they might do a better job than you. See, in those days, they thought such a significant decision should not be undertaken by somebody who doesn't have the maturity and life experience to know what's ahead of them. I'm not advocating for it, by the way. Actually, it's probably a good thing that our marriage was not arranged by our parents, because Diana's dad, for one, told her not to marry me. So we might not even be here if our marriage would have been arranged by parents. So I'm not advocating that. But if you want to get back into Joseph's time, the first stage was often when there were still children, and parents would make an arrangement and talk about an arrangement of their kids getting married to each other. The second stage came when those children grew up and entered into the stage of being youth. And at that point, a contract was entered into. It was called a betrothal. We don't talk about being betrothed anymore. But it was a contract, a formal contract that was entered to by the families, including the 2 people. And in many ways, for all intents and purposes, the couple, the young man and the young woman, were, for all intents and purposes, considered to be married. They still lived apart. They stayed living with their parents. There was no physical relationship between them, but they were considered to be married. So much so that if that was going to be, that relationship was not going to work out, it involved a divorce. A divorce had to take place. The period of betrothal was about a year, at which time then there would be a wedding that would formalize the marriage, and a final step of commitment for the marriage to take place. So here's this couple, Joseph and Mary, who are in that stage of betrothal. They have their whole life in front of them. She is possibly approaching the age of 15, although most likely younger, certainly not any older. And he is probably approaching the age of 20. They considered most men needed to be married if they're going to be responsible adults by the age of 20, or around that time. Nazareth is a very small village, probably no more than a couple hundred people. Anybody has lived here in a very small community of a couple hundred people? Everybody knows everybody. You live in a fishbowl, everybody knows what's going on about everything. So everyone knows what's going on. Joseph and Mary in many ways have grown up together, although there is probably a good 5 years in their age differences. But like many other couples in their marriage and planning their marriage and lifetime together, they have all the hopes and dreams of establishing a home, having children, and raising them there. I say that because we all enter a marriage with these hopes and these goals and these dreams. And then suddenly for them, all that seems to be taken away from them. Now, we're not told exactly how Joseph found out or whether or not he believed Mary when she first possibly told him that she was pregnant. And to be honest, it would seem like a stretch. I mean, can you imagine somebody come up and say, I'm pregnant by the Holy Spirit? This has not happened before. He must have felt, at the very least, to be in extreme conflict, wanting, like everything, to believe Mary, but yet wrestling with the social, cultural customs of that day. He basically had, when he found this news out, he basically had 3 options in front of him. One is that he could publicly shame Mary and divorce her and it would be perfectly acceptable for him to do that. He and his family would save face, and that was important. But it would forever mark Mary with the stigma that she would probably never be able to overcome. On the other hand, he could choose to find a way to divorce her quietly, to do this behind the scenes, and to gracefully find a way to end the contract, the betrothal, without exposing her to public disgrace. At least not at first. But whatever happened after that, when she had the baby, it was not going to be his problem, and she could always move away. Third option was that he could continue with the betrothal and follow through with the marriage. But to do so, for all intents and purposes, to everybody else around him, was to be an admission of guilt on his part, that he was the one that got her pregnant. Now, this can't be overlooked, and that there's not just these two people involved, but these are two families involved. And the shame that was theirs would not be just theirs alone, but they would drag their families through the mud of this experience as well. I want us to enter into the experience of Joseph needing to wrestle with how he handles this at a very young age, and how he makes a decision and what is the right thing to do. Well, by the time we get to verse 19, it seems that he has made up his mind, because it says, because he was a righteous man and did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. So he's come to this uneasy decision about what he's going to do. But I think here we have the first indication of the character of Joseph, of somebody who lives out his faith. It says he was a righteous man. By that, it's not saying he's this legalistic guy who follows the rules. The sense here is that the focus of his life is on living right and doing the right thing based on what he understood was in keeping with God's standard for his life. See, the root word for the word righteous there is the same root word for the word for justice. And in fact, in some translations, they say he was a just man. But when we come across that word of just or justice in the scripture, it's important to understand that this concept of justice isn't strictly what we understand as justice, which honestly we have a very limited, narrow perspective on justice. We tend to have a sense of justice when punishment is meted out, when the punishment fits the crime. And then we say justice has been done, and we've had a situation recently that's been in the news about that. And I'm not arguing against that. There needs to be justice in those situations and that sort of thing. But when God talks about justice, when he talks about, through the prophet Micah, he says, what does God require of you? But to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. I think in many ways, Micah is saying the same thing that Jesus said. He said, what is the most important commandment? Love God with all your heart, all your mind. Walk humbly with God. And what is next? Love your neighbor as yourself. Act justly, and love mercy. Justice in God's books has a lot to doing what is right so you don't have to experience punishment. When you come across the word of living a righteous life, it's somebody who lives right. It's the person who does the right things that at the right time. And a big part of what God calls justice is looking out for the marginalized in our lives, in our world around us, in our society. Joseph's faith is reflected in his character, in who he is on the inside, which then determines how he acts on the outside. But what is also important here is that his concern is not only for how this has affected him, but he cares about Mary, and he cares about how his decision will affect her. The decision he has arrived at is not a self-centered one, but one that he hoped was in her best interest as well. He is not trying to be vindictive and get back at her, but wanting to do the right thing in what must have seemed to him basically a no-win situation. But if we go on reading in Matthew says, after he had considered this, the sense again of the word that Matthew uses here is that after he had spent
time wrestling with all the options, weighing all the options that were in front of him and following them through in his mind to their logical consequences to determine which was the right course of action to take. He had no doubt had spent many sleepless nights trying to determine what that would be, what he should do. And he has finally come to a bit of an uneasy decision. And I suspect even out of exhaustion, he goes to bed and hopefully to catch some sleep and falls asleep there in the middle of the night. But his sleep is disrupted. His sleep is disrupted by a very vivid dream in which an angel comes to him and speaks to him. Now, this is the first of 4 times that we have a record here in chapters 1 and 2 of Matthew of God speaking to Joseph in a dream. And 3 of these experiences involve an angel specifically talking to him that has appeared and spoken to him. Again, I think we could easily miss a deeper implication here. And that is that Joseph must have had a very deep spiritual connection with God that went beyond just saying his prayers and showing up in the synagogue on the Sabbath. Because he seems to take these dreams in stride as a normal and regular way that God speaks into his life. This time, when the angel addresses him, the angel says, "Joseph, son of David." Well, being addressed in that way in itself must have meant something significant to Joseph, that there was something about the message that the angel was bringing to him that was more profound, because he's son of David, but generations down the road. What that implied was there's something to do with the Messiah that's coming, something to do with the throne. Well, the angel goes on to say, "Do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife." What the angel is literally saying is, don't shrink back from the challenge before you to take Mary as your wife. Don't kind of back away from that challenge. Don't take the easy road out. And here we have Joseph's response as another indication of who he is, what his character is like, and what it means to live your faith. And that is his response is in obedience to doing what he has been asked. And that took great courage. Courage because, remember, this is King Herod's territory. The king who ruthlessly eliminates any threat to his right to rule. And the Messiah born in the line of David would be seen as the one who had a legitimate claim to the throne. I think little did Joseph know how often he would have to act courageously to protect his wife and this child of promise. Now I want to point out here that courage is not the absence of fear, but rather it is doing what needs to be done and being carried along by faith with that deep trust and sense of confidence in God to show up and doing the right thing in the face of the fears that one might have. Joseph was a just man who lived his faith with courage in the face of the challenge that came his way in life. Now, we noted earlier before that genuine faith requires action. And that's what Joseph does when he wakes up. He takes action. Matthew says that when Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him. And this seems to, again, to be a hallmark of Joseph's faith, of how he lived out his faith in his life. That he followed through without any hesitation and in obedience of what he had been asked to do. In the next chapter, and we don't have time to read and discuss in detail this morning everything that takes place there, God communicates 3 more times by an angel to him coming in a dream. And in each case, there's no hesitation, no holding back, but Joseph wakes up, goes about what he's been asked to do immediately. The first instance is after the Magi arrive looking for, quote, the one who has been born to be king of the Jews. And we can only begin to imagine how what impact that had on King Herod. In fact, Matthew says that King Herod was greatly disturbed, and the word there disturbed is he's wildly disturbed. Remember, this guy's a bit of a maniac. But it also says all of Jerusalem was disturbed with him, because when Herod got disturbed, he disturbed the peace of everybody else around. So you didn't want Herod disturbed. But Joseph is warned again in a dream and told by an angel to flee to Egypt. And what we have follows there is that Herod does what Herod does, which is he massacres all children under 2 years of age in this region, just to make sure he gets the right one eliminated from being challenging for him, his right to rule. But Joseph gets up immediately and heads off on a journey to Egypt. Now, we can look at a map and say, well, it doesn't look that far away. We can fly there and probably from one place to the next in probably a couple hours. But it was a journey of close to 1,000 kilometers on foot. Now, my estimation is that even traveling at 20 to 30 kilometers a day, which would be a lot if you have a wife and a small child, you're looking at least a month of travel along the way. Wasn't an easy journey. At least the first part of the journey, they had to be traveling probably at night to avoid being detected so that they wouldn't be turned in. Finding places to stay along the way where they could hide out during the day. It was a journey that took great courage. It was an act of courage on the part of Joseph. When Herod finally dies, once again an angel comes to Joseph and lets him know that it's now safe to return to Israel. And again it says, Matthew immediately got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. He literally rises to the challenge, what is presented before him. And then when you get there, he says one more time, he's had a dream that says, don't settle in Judea, but go to your town of Nazareth. And that's where he settled. But getting through these experiences was only the beginning of his role as the adoptive dad to Jesus. I'm an adoptive dad. I adopted both my kids. And you stop to think about what you're taking on. As a father, it was going to be his responsibility to raise Jesus, to make sure that Jesus was well versed in the faith to which they held. Wrap your mind around that one. Joseph teaching God about God. I think sometimes we play down the absolute humanity of Jesus and forget the miracle of the incarnation is that Almighty God, who is our creator, think of the vastness of the universe, the God who created, shrunk himself down, 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 to eventually become this fetus that became this child that Mary carried for 9 months and gave birth to. And then was born and needed to be raised, needed his diapers changed like any other baby, needed to be fed, needed to be cared for, was very helpless. That isn't hard to wrap your mind around the fact that Almighty God did that. And then for Joseph to realize that he's in this place where he has to be the protective caregiver for this little baby who grew up into a child. That he has to ensure that he goes to school, that he shows up at the synagogue, and that he's learning his lessons. And I can only imagine a conversation between Joseph and Jesus, because Joseph would then also be teaching the skills of his trade as a carpenter. And I can imagine them working around and Joseph turning to Jesus and say, okay, what did you learn about God today? And possibly Jesus would answer, because one of the things that they did is the boys particularly had to memorize virtually the whole what we call the Old Testament. And whatever part they had been learning, he would probably repeat back and talk to Joseph about it. Joseph would have taught him his trade, that of a carpenter, and it seems that he was quite skilled himself. When we come across Jesus as an adult life, beginning his ministry, people look at him and say, who is this? They're amazed at his teaching. Isn't this the carpenter? Implying at least that he had a reputation as a skilled carpenter. The last indication that we have of Joseph being in the picture as the dad of Jesus is when Jesus is 12 years old and they had traveled to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover, as was their custom. But after that incident, Joseph seems to not just fade into the background again, but disappear from the picture altogether. We can only speculate why that is. Possible that Jesus had to bury his own dad and everything that goes with that. But I want to summarize here is that in Joseph we see someone not a lot unlike ourselves. He's an ordinary guy going about his ordinary life. He has a deep commitment to God, and his faith is not only about what he believes to be true, but something that significantly impacts and influences how he lives and how he goes about that everyday, ordinary life. What about you? How does your faith impact your everyday life? Does it have any kind of effect? His faith, that is Joseph's faith, has grown him in character to be someone who is deeply committed to living the right way, to doing the right thing no matter how difficult and challenging that might be. His faith is seen in that he is a man of integrity, a man of his word, who's loyal and faithful in serving those whom he loves and has been committed to taking care of. But you could also say that he regifted his faith not only by serving those he loved, but in the process serving in a way and a cause that he could not have possibly imagined how far-reaching it would be at the time. He simply stepped up. He showed up to do what he was asked to do, to be none other than the dad to a baby who would grow into a little boy, eventually become a young man who would be the Messiah. That was something that took great courage and great conviction. Our theme this year as we go through the season of Advent is that of regifting Christmas. That is that at Christmas we celebrate what God has given us. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. But we often want to keep the gifts to ourselves. And we talked about regifting. Often what we regift is something that we don't find use for and we don't need or don't want. But the challenge here is to regift something that you do need, that is useful, and that you do want. And I think as we discover when we regift what God has given us at Christmas time and give it away, it grows in its value and its significance and impact in our lives anyway. When it comes to regifting faith, we can do so by following Joseph's example about stepping out of the safety and security of our comfort zone and getting involved in what God is doing in the world around us and serving his purposes and living for something greater than our little lives. Listen, it doesn't mean that you do anything different necessarily than what you're doing right now. You just go about your life with a different perspective. Because you begin to go about your life with a sense of where is God at work around me and how can I become his presence in the life of somebody else. Sometimes that takes great sacrifice of time and even of money. But faith says we step out of those comfort zones. It takes a certain amount of faith to step out and put ourselves in a situation that might even be risky. And faith, as I always try to remind myself and others, is spelled R-I-S-K. Risk. Because where there's no risk, you don't need faith. You just don't. You don't need God to show up when you look at what you have and you say, I can do this on my own. But invariably, God calls us to do. He invites us to get involved. Where he invites us to get involved will always seem greater than what we feel that we have to offer. See, faith calls us to serve anyway, depending on and trusting in God in the moment. Along the way, we will discover that in most situations, most case situations, God chooses to accomplish His purpose in our lives and His world in some ways that defy our logic and defy our reasoning. When you really step back from the Christmas story, from the birth of Jesus, and you say, really, that's how you chose to start out? It's illogical, it's irrational. It does not make sense. But the reality is that God chooses often to work in our lives and the other lives of others in the strangest sorts of ways, if we only have enough faith to step out and join Him in what He is doing, much like Joseph did. As we close, I just want to sit here. I'm going to put a song on. There will be some graphics with it. But I want to invite you to pause and reflect on what it means to live your faith out the way Joseph did. So listen reflectively to the song.
I'm sure he must have been surprised at where this road had taken him, 'cause never in a million lives would he have dreamed of Bethlehem. And standing at the manger, he saw with his own eyes the message from the angel come alive. And Joseph said, why me? I'm just a simple man of trade. Why him with all the rulers in the world? Why here? Inside this stable filled with hay. Why her? She's just an ordinary girl. And now I'm not one to second guess what angels have to say. But this is such a strange way to save the world. To think of how it could have been if Jesus had come as he deserved. There would have been no Bethlehem, no lowly shepherds at his birth. But Joseph knew the reason love had to reach so far. And as he held the Savior in his arms, he must have thought, why me? I'm just a simple man of trade. Why him with all the rulers in the world? Why here? Inside this stable filled with hay. Why her? She's just an ordinary girl. And now I'm not one to second guess what angels have to say. But this is such a strange way to save the world. Have to such a strange way to save the world. This is such a strange way, such a strange way, a strange way to save the world. Whoa.
God has gone to great lengths to become part of your world. He invites you to become part of what He is doing in the world and around you. Challenge is to live out your faith with courage. Let your character be molded by, and to ask God, where are you at work around me, and how can I serve your purposes? And I believe with all my heart and firmly, if you go about this week with that regular prayer on your lips, you will see with new eyes what has taken place around you. And hopefully you will accept that invitation to regift your faith to others. So I'm going to ask you next Sunday, how are you regifting Christmas? It'll be my last chance to talk to you, and then on Christmas Eve we have a joint service together. So I want to hear back how you are regifting hope and faith. And next week we talk about peace. Of course, if you care to stay, we're going to engage in some kind of discussion on the sermon. If you bring I've set up some questions that we can discuss, but I'm more interested to know what you would want to talk about, what we've talked about today. So we can talk about that as well.